Our group of friends had decided to meet up at this small bar in downtown Seattle. It was just a regular Friday night, nothing out of the ordinary. Katie, my best friend since college, was extra excited because she had a Tinder date lined up later that evening. She'd been chatting with this guy Dan for a couple of weeks, and she was convinced he was different. "He's got his life together," she told me, laughing as she sipped her drink. "Not like those other guys. He's got a real job, he's funny, I've got a good feeling about this one." We teased her a little, as usual. Stuff like, "Don't forget to share your location and tell him you're packing pepper spray." Just the kind of jokes friends make to keep the mood light. But looking back, I wish we'd been a little more serious about it. Katie brushed it off, smiling. Around 9 p.m., Dan texted her to say he was waiting outside. She hugged us goodbye, telling me she'd call me later to let me know how it went. As she left, I noticed she seemed genuinely happy, excited, but not nervous. I remember thinking how nice it was to see her like that after her rough breakup last year. A little before midnight, she did call me. Her voice sounded normal, upbeat even. She told me the date went well and that Dan had already called her a taxi to take her home. "See? He's thoughtful," she said, laughing softly. I told her to text me once she got home safely. She promised she would, and then she hung up. That was the last time I ever heard from her. The next morning, I woke up to find no message from Katie. That wasn't like her at all. She always texted, even if it was late. At first, I told myself she'd probably just fallen asleep. But by noon, I started to feel uneasy. I called her. No answer. I texted her. Nothing. By the afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I drove to her apartment and knocked on her door. No response. I checked with her neighbors, but no one had seen her. That's when I called her parents. They hadn't heard from her either. Her mom's voice cracked when she asked if I thought Katie was okay. I didn't know what to say. We reported her missing that evening. The police took down the details and said they'd look into it, but their tone felt detached, like they didn't expect much to come of it. They told us to wait, that she might just show up. But I knew Katie, and this wasn't like her. 2 days later, the police finally found a lead. They'd checked the surveillance footage near the bar and saw Katie getting into a black sedan with Dan, the taxi. At first, everything seemed normal. Dan opened the door for her and they both got in. But then, a few blocks away, the car turned off its route and headed toward an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. That's when it all started to fall apart. The car never made it to Katie's apartment. When the police traced the plate number, they discovered it wasn't a registered taxi at all. The driver was flagged in their system as someone with a history of violent crimes, including kidnapping charges that had been dropped due to lack of evidence. Dan, the guy Katie had trusted, wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name wasn't even Dan. He had a long history of using fake identities to lure women, and the police believed he was working with the driver as part of some sick scheme. For days, search teams combed through the industrial district and nearby woods, but there was no sign of Katie. Every time the phone rang, I jumped, hoping it was her calling to say she was okay, but deep down, I knew it wasn't going to happen. A week later, they found her. She was in a shallow grave in the woods, less than a mile from where the car had been abandoned. The autopsy revealed she'd been assaulted and suffered injuries that ultimately caused her death. The driver was arrested first, and then Dan, or whatever his real name was caught a few days later trying to flee the state. The trial dragged on for months. I sat in the courtroom every day, watching those monsters show no remorse for what they'd done. Katie's parents were shattered. Her mom couldn't stop crying, and her dad just stared straight ahead like he wasn't even there anymore. In the end, they both got life sentences, but it didn't feel like justice. Nothing could bring Katie back. Nothing could undo the way her life ended, full of trust in someone who didn't deserve it. I think about her all the time. Her laugh, her optimism, the way she always believed in people. And I think about how quickly that trust was betrayed. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Always be cautious, especially with people you don't know well. Never get into a car unless you're sure of who's driving. Check the license plate, the driver's name, everything. And if something feels off, trust your instincts. Katie didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does. But her story is a reminder that the world can be darker than we realize. I just hope it keeps someone else safe. My daughter Savannah was in her second year at university, living in a dorm in Philadelphia. One afternoon she called me, her voice a mix of excitement and nerves. She told me she had started seeing someone named Jason. They had only gone on a couple of dates, but he seemed different. That day, he invited her to a photo shoot in the park, saying she had the perfect look for a modeling project he was working on. Savannah was hesitant at first, but Jason was persistent, charming, and had a way of making her feel special. She finally agreed. At first, I didn't think much of it. Savannah had always been cautious, a little shy even, so hearing her take a leap like this made me proud. But there was something about the way she spoke about him that lingered with me, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. The next day, Savannah called again, but this time she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. It took a minute to piece it all together. She said Jason had sent her some photos, intimate ones, photos she couldn't remember taking. Her voice cracked as she explained that Jason was demanding money, $500, or else he'd send the pictures to her friends, her professors, and post them online. She was panicking, asking me what to do, and I could hear the fear in her voice. I told her to come home immediately, but she said she couldn't. He had told her if she left town or blocked him, he'd upload everything right away. She begged me not to tell her dad. I tried to stay calm, telling her we'd figure it out, but inside I was losing it. How did this happen? How could someone do this to her? That evening, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in cybercrimes. He was straightforward. There was no guarantee we could stop Jason before he acted, but he suggested we file a police report as soon as possible. Savannah was reluctant. She kept saying, "What if it just makes things worse?" Savannah, by the time I convinced her to come to the station, Jason had already sent the photos to her classmates. She found out when one of her friends texted her, "Savannah, I'm so sorry, but you need to know what's going around." Savannah showed me the message with trembling hands, her face pale. I could see the shame and horror in her eyes. We sat together as she went through her phone, scrolling through messages and screenshots of people whispering, judging, mocking her. Some were trying to defend her, but the damage was already done. By the time we got to the police station, it felt like the whole world had seen those pictures. The officers were sympathetic but blunt. Tracking Jason down wouldn't be easy, especially if he was using fake accounts or burner devices. They explained how these predators operate, how they pick their victims carefully, isolating them, using trust as a weapon. It made my stomach turn to think someone had done this to my daughter, used her innocence against her. Savannah was spiraling. She wasn't eating, barely sleeping, and refused to go to class. The university found out too. Somehow the photos had even made their way to faculty. Savannah got called into a meeting with the dean, who said that while they sympathized, her behavior had brought unwanted attention to the school. They didn't expel her outright, but the message was clear. They wanted her gone. I watched my daughter, a bright, ambitious young woman who had dreams of becoming a journalist, fall apart in front of me. Jason was still out there, still sending her threats, even as her world crumbled around her. She kept saying, "I don't understand how this became my life. I didn't do anything wrong." Savannah's life unraveled faster than I could have imagined. Her friends stopped calling, some outright avoiding her. The whispers followed her everywhere, and every time her phone buzzed, I saw her flinch. I tried to get her into therapy, but she said she didn't see the point. She was barely holding on, and I felt so helpless watching my daughter crumble under the weight of someone else's cruelty. One day, I decided I couldn't just sit by anymore. I reached out to an old friend who worked in IT security. He offered to dig into Jason's online presence, see if we could find anything that could lead us to him. What he uncovered made my blood run cold. Jason wasn't even his real name. He had a trail of similar cases, young women he'd targeted, manipulated, and blackmailed. In every case, the pattern was the same: charm them, gain their trust, get compromising material, and then destroy their lives. And worse, he was still active, setting up new profiles and targeting more women. We gave all this information to the police, but they said without a solid location or clear identity, they couldn't do much. Jason knew how to cover his tracks. Savannah, on the other hand, was becoming more withdrawn by the day. She stopped leaving her dorm, ignoring my calls for days at a time. I felt like I was losing her, piece by piece. Then came the final blow. Savannah's part-time job let her go, claiming her situation had become a distraction. She called me that night, sobbing uncontrollably, saying, "I'm nothing now, Mom. I'm just a joke to everyone." I told her over and over that it wasn't true, that none of this was her fault, but the words felt empty, even to me. The damage had been done, and Jason had taken so much from her already. I couldn't stop her pain, and it was killing me. A few days later, Savannah didn't answer her phone. At first, I thought maybe she needed space, but as the hours passed, I started to panic. I called the dorm supervisor and begged them to check on her. They promised to send someone up and call me back. That call came only 20 minutes later, but those minutes felt like hours. When the phone rang, I already knew. Savannah was gone. She'd left a note, apologizing, saying she couldn't see a way out. She wrote about how ashamed she was, how she felt like she'd let everyone down, but she hadn't. She was my daughter, my beautiful, smart, funny Savannah. Jason had taken everything from her, but the blame was his, not hers, never hers. The next few weeks were a blur, planning the funeral, explaining to friends and family what had happened, seeing the pity in their eyes. All I could think about was that I'd failed her. I should have done more, fought harder, seen the signs earlier. And Jason? He vanished. The police said they were still investigating, but I knew better. He was already on to his next victim. It's been almost a year now, and I still see Savannah everywhere, in the books she loved, in the smell of her favorite perfume. But the pain doesn't fade. If anything, it sharpens. I joined a support group for parents who've lost children to cybercrimes. It's helped in a way, knowing we're not alone, but it also terrifies me how common this is. How many predators are out there, waiting to destroy someone's life for their own sick gain. If you're reading this, please, talk to your kids. Teach them to be careful, to never trust someone too quickly, no matter how charming they seem. And if they find themselves in trouble, remind them that no photo, no mistake is ever worth their life. There's always a way out, even if they can't see it in the moment. Yeah, Jason's still out there, as far as I know. The thought makes my skin crawl. But if sharing Savannah's story can stop just one person from falling into his trap, then maybe, just maybe, something good can come out of this nightmare. I met Brad at a cozy little cafe in Houston. It was one of those random encounters that feel like they're straight out of a rom-com. He approached me while I was waiting for my latte, complimented my taste in books because I had one open on the table, and struck up a conversation. He was charming, polite, and had this easy smile that made him seem completely trustworthy. By the time we finished our coffee, he'd asked me out for dinner. I hesitated for a second, but I said yes. He seemed so genuine. Dinner was nice, nothing too fancy, just a casual Italian place nearby. Brad was funny, attentive, and kept the conversation flowing effortlessly. He asked me about my work, my family, even the little details like what kind of music I liked. There wasn't a single red flag. If anything, I felt like maybe I'd gotten lucky. After the meal, he offered to drive me home. I hesitated again, my gut telling me to just call an Uber. But it was late, and his car was parked right outside. Plus, he seemed safe. So, I agreed. His car was spotless, which honestly impressed me a bit. Most guys I dated couldn't care less about keeping their car clean. We got in, and he started driving. The route was familiar. I knew the way back to my place well. We chatted a little more, but he seemed quieter now, like he was thinking about something. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just scrolling through my phone, trying to come up with a polite way to say I wasn't ready to invite him in when we got to my apartment. About 10 minutes into the drive, I realized something was off. He took a left turn when he should have gone straight. At first, I thought maybe he'd missed the turn or was trying to avoid traffic. "Hey, you're going the wrong way," I said, laughing lightly, trying to keep it casual. He glanced over at me, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, I know a shortcut." Something about his tone felt off. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, like he wasn't trying to reassure me at all. I nodded, but my hands started getting clammy. I tried to remind myself not to overreact. Maybe he really did know a faster way. Then he turned onto a completely empty road. No streetlights, no cars, nothing but darkness. My stomach dropped. I looked out the window, trying to figure out where we were, but I couldn't see any familiar landmarks. "Brad, this isn't the way to my place," I said, louder this time, my voice firm. He didn't respond. "Brad, stop the car," I said again, panic creeping into my voice. That's when I heard the soft click of the doors locking. My heart started racing. I reached for the lock on my side, but it wouldn't budge. He must have control over all the locks. "Relax," he said finally, his voice calm but cold, completely different from how he'd been earlier. "I just want to talk. You seem tense back there." "What? Tense?" I was starting to feel trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in. I glanced at my phone in my lap and thought about texting someone, anyone, but I was afraid he'd see and take it away. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll see," he said. That's all he said. I knew I had to do something. Sitting there, waiting to see what he meant by "you'll see," wasn't an option. My mind raced, weighing my choices. I could try reasoning with him, but the eerie calmness in his voice told me he wasn't the kind of person you reason with. I could scream, but the road was completely deserted and no one would hear me. My phone felt heavy in my hand, but I knew if I tried to use it, he'd notice. Then, I saw it. A red light ahead. It was the first sign of civilization in what felt like miles. My heart jumped. If the car stopped, I'd have a chance. I didn't know if I could do it, if I could actually fling myself out of a moving car, but the alternative was too terrifying to consider. As we neared the light, I shifted slightly in my seat, pretending to adjust my purse. My hand found the door handle and I gripped it tightly, praying it would work. If it didn't, I had no backup plan. The car slowed as we approached the light, and for a split second, I debated whether I should wait for him to turn his head or just go for it. I decided there wasn't time to overthink. The car came to a stop. I yanked the handle with all my strength, and to my relief, the door flew open. Without hesitating, I jumped. The fall was brutal. I hit the pavement hard, the impact sending pain shooting through my body. I rolled a few times before coming to a stop on the rough asphalt. My hands and knees were scraped raw, and my head was spinning, but I was alive. Alive and out of that car. Behind me, I heard Brad shout something, but I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline drowning out the pain, and started running toward the light. My only thought was to get as far away from him as possible. A truck was stopped at the light, its headlights illuminating the road ahead. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The driver, a middle-aged man, jumped out, clearly startled. "What the hell's going on?" he asked, rushing toward me. Before I could answer, Brad's car sped off, tires screeching. I collapsed against the side of the truck, shaking uncontrollably. The man called the police, while his wife, who was in the passenger seat, handed me a blanket from their car. I couldn't stop crying. I didn't even know what to say when the dispatcher asked what had happened. He tried to take me," was all I managed to get out. When the police arrived, I gave them Brad's description and as much information as I could about the car and the route he'd taken. It turned out I wasn't his first victim. Brad was wanted in connection with several kidnappings across the state, and worse, some of those women were still missing. They caught him a week later thanks to surveillance footage from the cafe where we'd met. Seeing his face on the news made my skin crawl. It was like looking at a stranger, completely different from the guy I'd thought I was having a fun first date with. I'm lucky to be alive. The doctor said my injuries could have been much worse. I had a concussion, some fractured ribs, and needed stitches for the cuts on my hands and knees. But I walked away. A lot of women didn't. Now, I don't care how nice someone seems. If I don't know them, I don't get in their car. Period. If you're reading this, please take my advice. Always trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. I wish I'd listened to mine before getting into that car. I met Tom on a popular dating app. He seemed perfect, smart, funny, and charming in an effortless kind of way. His profile said he worked in finance and lived just outside Chicago. We hit it off immediately in our chats. He wasn't like other guys who jumped straight to shallow conversations or made weird comments. Tom was thoughtful, and he actually listened. So when he asked me out for dinner at this cozy little Italian restaurant downtown, I couldn't say no. Honestly, I was excited. It felt like one of those meet cutes you hear about where everything just falls into place. When I got to the restaurant, he was already there, waiting by the entrance with a smile that could disarm anyone. He'd picked a table by the window, where the lights from the city reflected off the glass, giving everything this warm glow. Over the appetizers, we laughed about awkward first dates we'd had in the past. He made me feel so at ease, like I'd known him for years. It all felt so natural, almost too good to be true. But then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, things took a turn. It wasn't dramatic, just odd. We were talking about our jobs, and he mentioned he was in the process of starting a new role at some big firm downtown. He asked me if I'd be willing to sign a letter of recommendation for him. I remember freezing for half a second, confused. "For what?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He laughed and waved it off, saying it was just a formality, something about needing a character reference for his new employer. It didn't make sense to me. Why would someone need a recommendation from someone they just met? I joked, "Wouldn't your boss or a coworker be a better fit for that?" He shrugged, saying it was more personal this way. Something about it showing his good standing in the community. The way he said it was so smooth, like he'd rehearsed it. I didn't push further. But something about the request didn't sit right with me. When the check came, he reached for it immediately. I offered to split it, but he smiled and said, "I've got it." He paid in cash, which I thought was a little unusual these days. But again, I didn't question it. He walked me to my car afterward and gave me a hug goodbye. "This was great," he said. "Let's do it again soon." I agreed, and as I drove home, I remember replaying the night in my head, trying to shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. The next morning, Tom texted me, thanking me for a lovely evening. He brought up the letter of recommendation again, casually slipping it into the conversation. I brushed it off, saying I didn't think I'd be the right person for something like that. His tone shifted slightly, but not enough to be alarming. "It's no big deal," he said. "I just thought you'd understand, since you're so smart and kind." The flattery worked, at least enough for me to consider it. By the third day, he sent me a draft of the letter, already written and ready for me to sign. All I had to do was scan it and send it back. At this point, I started to feel uneasy. The language in the letter was overly formal, almost like it wasn't meant for a job at all. I noticed it mentioned my long-standing personal relationship with him, which obviously wasn't true. I decided to call him and clear the air. When I brought it up, he acted like I was being overly cautious. "It's just a letter," he said, his tone light but a little too dismissive. "It's not like you're signing a contract or anything. You trust me, right?" That last part, "you trust me," hung in the air for a second too long. I felt this knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Still, I told him I needed more time to think about it. He said he understood, but I could sense a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. That evening, I went back and reread the letter. The more I looked at it, the more suspicious it seemed. Why was he so insistent on me signing this? It wasn't normal. I decided to do a little digging online, looking up the company he mentioned and trying to find more about him. But when I searched for his name, nothing matched. No LinkedIn, no social media presence, just a void. My heart sank. The more I searched, the worse it got. There was no trace of Tom anywhere. No LinkedIn, no Facebook, nothing. I tried the company he mentioned, but it didn't exist. That sinking feeling in my stomach turned into full-blown panic. I grabbed my phone and texted him, asking for more details about the job. He didn't reply. I waited an hour, then 2, but nothing. I even called, but it went straight to voicemail. By the next morning, I was spiraling. Something wasn't right and I needed answers. I decided to message a friend who worked in HR to ask if she'd ever heard of a job requiring a personal recommendation from someone outside of work. She immediately texted back, "Absolutely not. That's sketchy as hell. Don't sign anything." That was all the confirmation I needed. I blocked his number and deleted his texts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger somehow. It didn't help that later that day, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street from my apartment. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It's a city, after all. Cars come and go. But this one didn't. It stayed there for hours, engine off, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. That evening, I got an email from a loan company I'd never heard of. The subject line read, "Loan Confirmation." Loan confirmation, account active. My heart dropped as I opened it. Somehow, there was a loan in my name for $25,000. I scrolled through the details, my hands shaking. It had my full name, my address, even my social security number. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I called the loan company immediately, explaining that I hadn't applied for anything. The customer service rep asked if I'd co-signed for someone recently. My mind flashed back to that recommendation letter. Could it have been more than that? I told her I hadn't signed anything, but her tone grew skeptical. "Ma'am, this application was submitted with your signature attached." I hung up and tore through my emails. Sure enough, there was a document from Tom buried in the drafts folder. It was the recommendation he'd asked me to sign, except now it was labeled as a co-signer agreement. I couldn't believe it. I'd never sent it back to him, but somehow my signature was on it. I immediately called the police. The officer I spoke to sounded sympathetic but not particularly hopeful. "This kind of fraud is hard to trace," he said. "These guys usually disappear before we can catch them." Still, I filed a report and contacted my bank to freeze my accounts. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump, and I kept peeking through the blinds to check if that black sedan was still there. It was. The next morning, it was gone, but the damage had already been done. Over the next week, I was bombarded with calls from collection agencies demanding payments for credit cards I'd never opened and loans I'd never taken out. Tom had completely cleaned me out. My credit score tanked overnight, and I started getting letters from banks threatening legal action if I didn't pay. I tried contacting the app where we'd met to report him, but his profile had already been deleted. It was like he'd never existed. The police said they'd look into it, but I knew the chances of finding him were slim. I wasn't just broke. I was in debt for money I'd never even seen. The scariest part? I still don't know how he forged my signature or got access to my information. Did he hack into my phone? Was he watching me somehow? To this day, I'm paranoid about sharing anything online or meeting someone new. I'm still fighting to clear my name, but it's been a nightmare. I had to sell my car to cover some of the debt, and my apartment is next. What started as a fun first date turned into the worst mistake of my life. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And never, ever sign anything for someone you barely know. I thought I was just being paranoid, but I wish I'd listened to that voice in my head. Now I'm paying for it. Literally. Monica lived right across the hall from me in San Francisco. We weren't best friends or anything. Dating has always been a bit of a nightmare for me. When I finally came out as gay, I was hoping things would turn around. But it wasn't that simple. The dating pool? Much smaller than I expected. 9 times out of 10, when I got interested in someone, she wasn't even into women. It got frustrating. So, I decided it was time for some help to figure out who was actually on the same page. That's when I signed up for an app called Luna, a place where women who liked other women could connect. After I set up my profile, I was surprised by how many women were actually out there, and I just hadn't come across them before. It was a relief, to be honest. My biggest issue had always been finding women who were into women, and suddenly that roadblock was out of the way. Feeling more confident than I had in ages, I jumped into chatting. I started talking to a few girls, but there was one in particular who caught my attention. She lived just 2 towns over from me. The fact that she was so close made me a little giddy. I'd be lying if I said I didn't start imagining all sorts of things between us. Can you tell I was crushing pretty hard? She had this playful attitude that hooked me right away. Plus, her photos were exactly my type. So when I finally worked up the nerve to suggest we meet in person for dinner, I was beyond excited when she agreed. I showed up at the diner a bit early, like 10 minutes or so. It was in her town, not mine, so I gave myself extra time in case I got lost. I had spent way too long getting ready, but at least I wasn't late. The place wasn't anything fancy, no reservation needed, so I just walked in, grabbed a table, and waited. And by waited, I mean I nervously messed with my hair every 2 minutes, paranoid that I was wrecking it. After about the 5th time fixing it in the mirror, I realized she was running late. I glanced around, thinking maybe she'd walked in and was just having trouble spotting me. But besides a family near the entrance and some creepy guy in the back booth who kept glancing over at me, There was no sign of her. I figured she was just running late. No big deal, right? A few more minutes passed, so I shot her a quick text to check in. It showed as read almost instantly, but there was no reply. That's when the sinking feeling started. Did she bail? Did I really get stood up? After all the time I spent getting ready, worrying about how this date would go, now I'm just sitting here alone with the creep in the corner still eyeing me between checking his phone? I felt stupid, embarrassed, and more than a little frustrated. Trying not to freak out, I told myself maybe she was driving and just couldn't text back, so I decided to call her just to make sure everything was okay. But the second I hit dial, I heard a ringtone, not from my phone, but from somewhere close. My stomach dropped as the guy in the corner frantically silenced his phone. Right after that, my screen flashed. Call declined. The dude locked eyes with me, and my gut screamed that something was seriously wrong. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my stuff, heart racing, and made a beeline for the door. As I stepped outside, I glanced over my shoulder and saw him following, jogging toward me, calling my name. How did he know my name? Nope, absolutely not. I practically sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door and jumped in. He was just a few feet away, still calling after me. I slammed the door, threw the car in drive, and got out of there as fast as I could, watching him fade into the distance in my rearview mirror. When I got home, I tossed my bag onto the table and collapsed onto my bed, tears welling up. I felt so stupid. How did I not see that coming? I almost deleted the app right then and there, but for some reason I didn't. I decided to give it one more shot, and believe it or not, that's how I ended up meeting my current girlfriend. So yeah, dating apps can be terrifying, but sometimes they lead you to the right person. Just always stay cautious. This happened a couple of summers ago when I was 22. I was staying with my parents for the break before my final year of university. I was pretty bored, so I downloaded a dating app, and after a bit of swiping, I matched with a girl named Rachel. I'm not sure which app it was, maybe Tinder or something, but we chatted for a while and eventually I got her Snapchat. I preferred talking there anyway, so we started snapping each other. Rachel seemed chill, but there was something a little off about her replies. She'd say things that didn't quite make sense, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly felt strange. Maybe it was just her sense of humor. Either way, I kept talking to her out of curiosity. It's not like I had anything better to do. We didn't talk constantly, just exchanged snaps here and there, mostly random selfies. After 2 days, we were snapping casually but hadn't made any plans to meet up. It wasn't serious, just something to pass the time. That night, I hung out with my buddy Matt. We grabbed some takeout and went back to his place, which was about 10 minutes from mine. I got home around 11 p.m., snapped a few people, including Rachel, and then went to bed. A few hours later, I woke up feeling really out of it. I reached for my phone and saw it was nearly 3 a.m. That's when I noticed something weird out of the corner of my eye. I turned towards the window and there was someone standing outside, watching me. My heart jumped into my throat and I stumbled back, freaking out. After squinting through the darkness, I realized it looked like Rachel, the girl I'd been snapping for the past few days. My head spun with confusion. How could she be here? I thought maybe I was still half asleep, but the panic in my chest told me I was fully awake. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me through the glass. It was too dark to make out her face clearly, but I could tell it was her. In a daze, I grabbed my phone. I wasn't sure what else to do, so I opened Snapchat, figuring I'd message her to get away from my window. When I clicked on her profile, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Her Bitmoji was right next to mine on the Snap map. That's when it hit me. She'd been tracking my location through the app. I quickly sent her a snap. "Why are you outside my window? This is creepy." I watched as the message went through, and just to cover my back, I took a screenshot of her location next to mine. A few seconds after I sent the message, I saw her figure move away from the window, disappearing into the shadows. For a minute or two, nothing happened. Then I saw that she'd opened the message, but she didn't reply. She left it on, read. I got up and peered out the window, scanning the yard for any sign of her, but she was gone. Not wanting to take any chances, I left my room and looked through other windows in the house, hoping to catch a glimpse of where she might have gone. But she had vanished. After a few minutes of searching, I went back to my room, feeling unsettled. I checked Snapchat again, and that's when I noticed I was blocked. Just like that, she was gone from my life. No explanation, no follow-up. She had also disappeared from the dating app as if she was never there. I couldn't shake how bizarre the whole thing was. What did she want? Why was she outside my window, watching me like that? I still have the screenshot saved on my phone, and every time I see it, I'm reminded of how terrifying that night was. This all happened about 4 summers ago, though the details are still pretty clear in my head. For context, I've been on more than my fair share of bad dates and found myself in some pretty dumb spots before. Back then, I was a 26-year-old woman figuring things out. It kicked off with a match on the Bumble app. He had that geeky vibe that I liked. Glasses, messy hair, the whole deal. His profile was full of photos of him hiking and exploring places, giving off a thrill-seeker energy. I was intrigued. After noticing I'd checked out his profile, he sent me a message. We flirted a bit, and numbers were exchanged, even though he lived around 45 minutes away. He mentioned he wasn't planning to come to my town anytime soon, so meeting wasn't likely. I appreciated the honesty, at least he wasn't wasting my time. Then, a few days later, I got a text from him out of nowhere. He said he was in my town for work and asked if I wanted to join him at a bar. Since I happened to be nearby, I agreed. The weird part was he offered to pick me up. Looking back, I know it wasn't the best idea, but I said yes, even though the bar was just a 5-minute walk from where I was. When he finally showed up, way later than expected, something felt off. It turned out he wasn't even at the bar like he said. When I got into his car, a rental, I realized he was a terrible driver. It felt like he had just learned to drive the day before. We circled around aimlessly until he asked me to choose a place to go, but he didn't want to stay in the area because parking was too hard. I picked a spot about 20 minutes away, a busy place with lots of parking, thinking it would be safer to be in a crowded area with a stranger. Once we got there, he started pushing me to drink more than I was comfortable with. I'm not a heavy drinker, and I made that clear, but he kept insisting. "Come on, it's just a pub, nothing serious," he kept saying. Reluctantly, I gave in and had one drink, but he immediately pressured me to have another. His persistence was irritating, but somehow his charm kept me from leaving right away. At one point, I spotted a familiar face, an old classmate from years back. I made sure to wave and make it obvious that I knew someone there. In my head, it was my way of letting him know that he wasn't the only person aware of my whereabouts. Normally, I'm not paranoid, but something in the back of my mind was telling me to stay alert. After what felt like hours of awkward conversation and forced laughs, I finally told him I was ready to leave. Instead of taking me back, he suggested we cross the street to grab coffee. At that moment, something just felt off. Neither of us had drunk much, so it wasn't like we needed to sober up. Coffee seemed like a weird suggestion, but I went with it. We sat there, sipping our cups, while he rambled on about this amazing Airbnb he had rented nearby. It was in a quiet part of town, a bit farther from the city. He kept talking about how it was super cozy, and he had the whole place to himself. Then, of course, came the invitation for me to come check it out. I kept politely saying no, tossing out different reasons why I couldn't go. Every time I did, he found some excuse to counter me. It was getting exhausting, so I eventually agreed, only on the condition that he'd drive me back home first to grab some stuff. I didn't want to go at all, but I had this gut feeling he wasn't going to let me off easily. He seemed happy with my answer, so we left. As we were driving towards my place, though, he suddenly changed plans. Instead of taking me home, he suggested stopping by a convenience store to grab me some travel toiletries, so I wouldn't need to pick up anything from my apartment. That's when I really started to panic. My whole plan was to get away from him, and now it felt like he was trying to trap me. Something about him just felt wrong, and I was kicking myself for getting back into the car in the first place. He started driving towards a rural area, miles away from any store. Definitely no 7-Elevens out there. I mentioned, trying to stay calm, that I'd changed my mind and just wanted to go home. That's when he said something that made my blood run cold. He casually mentioned that the Airbnb wasn't just his, he was actually sharing it with the owners. He said they were really nice and fun and that they liked to drink and play games. My stomach dropped, because earlier he had clearly told me he had the whole place to himself. I knew right then I couldn't let on that I'd caught his lie, so I played along, acting all excited, and said something like, "Oh, I'll need to change into my cute fluffy pajamas. No way I'm staying in this dress all night." I threw in some stuff about needing my meds, saying I absolutely couldn't miss a dose. Somehow, that convinced him, and he turned the car around. As we got closer to the city, I felt a little better, but still on edge. At that point, I just wanted out of the situation as fast as possible. When we were almost at my place, I realized there was no way I could let him know where I lived. So after the fine motorcycle had gone by, he was already hinting that he'd come inside once we got there, and there was no chance in hell I was letting that happen. I was scanning for any way to escape, knowing that if he really wanted to, he could easily drive me somewhere secluded in just a few minutes. We pulled up to a stop sign, and by some stroke of luck, there were people crossing the street. That was my moment. I quickly opened the door and calmly said, "You know, I'm not feeling great. I'll text you later." Without waiting for a reply, I got out of the car and headed straight through a nearby park. There was a path that cars couldn't access, so I took it, not daring to look back until I was out of sight. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, I saw him in the car, staring at me with the most furious expression I've ever seen. Even now, the thought of it gives me chills. An hour later, I found that he had blocked me on Bumble. Looking back, I think he suggested the coffee so he could spike my drink or something. He probably told me up front we'd never meet just to cover his tracks. I'm sure he had no good intentions that night. Since then, I've been way more cautious about dating. I actually met my fiance through Bumble, but I was a lot more careful the next time around, always meeting in public and making sure I had my own way to leave. My name's Alice, and I've always found it easier to connect with people online than face-to-face, but that hasn't stopped me from running into a few nightmare situations. This one, though, still freaks me out to this day. I was about 20 at the time. I'd gone on a date with a guy I met on an app. I'll just call him D. It started out pretty normal, or so I thought. We took a walk around town, just talking while the sun set. I'm the type who's always out and about, so I didn't mind walking. But his conversation kept getting strange. He would steer the topics in weird directions, ignoring whatever I had to say. Still, I tried to shrug it off. Eventually, he suggested we go back to his place for pizza and a movie. At first, I didn't think it was too odd. I agreed. But it wasn't until a few minutes later that I realized we were already halfway to his apartment. I didn't even notice he had been leading me there the whole time. We got to his place, and as the movie started, he kept trying to cuddle and kiss me. It's the same exact pattern. I wasn't feeling it, so I tried to make space between us, which only annoyed him. I ended up sitting on the floor as far from the couch as I could get. He got pissed, started throwing passive-aggressive comments my way, like I had done something wrong. What made it worse, he never ordered the pizza. I was starving by that point, but then, out of nowhere, I felt this sharp pain in my stomach. It hit hard. I excused myself to the bathroom and realized I was bleeding. A lot. Something was really wrong. When I came out and told him I needed to leave, he snapped, getting angrier than ever before. I tried to grab my shoes, but he snatched them out of my hands, along with my bag. Before I could react, he shoved me into his bedroom and onto the bed. He muttered something about how I should just sleep and drop my stuff right next to him. Then, without a word, he turned his back to me and laid down. I was stuck there for what seemed like hours, listening to his breathing get deeper until he started snoring. That's when I knew he was out cold. I moved as quietly as I could, sliding off the bed and onto the floor. I crawled across the room, inching closer to my shoes and purse. Once I had them, I crawled toward the door, praying it wouldn't creak when I opened it. I slipped on my shoes, unlocked the door, and managed to get out without making a sound. As soon as the door closed behind me, I sprinted down the stairs and into the street. I kept running, heart pounding, not stopping until I finally made it home. I barely had time to deal with what was happening to me physically, rushing to change clothes and handle the medical emergency I was going through. I collapsed in the bathroom, overwhelmed. My roommate, who had been sleeping, eventually found me crying in the tub, still trying to process everything that had happened. It's an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone, especially if depression is the root cause of your... Please, be careful out there. This happened a few years ago when I was still using dating apps. I wasn't one to swipe right on just anyone, but there was this one guy, let's call him Brian, who caught my eye. He looked decent, close to my age, and his bio mentioned he was into startups and always hustling with new business ideas. I guess I was attracted to that entrepreneurial vibe, so I swiped right. To my surprise, he matched with me too, and things kicked off from there. We exchanged a few messages. I told him about how I was studying to become a nurse and attending night school, while he gave me vague details about his life. I did ask about his ventures, curious about what he actually did, but he always found a way to dodge those questions. I figured maybe he didn't want to come off as bragging or thought I was just in it for his money. Yeah, in hindsight, I should have thought it was shadier, but I let it slide. Eventually, we decided to meet up for dinner. Brian suggested this local steakhouse he apparently loved, raving about their prime rib. I'll admit, that made me more excited about the date. I mean, steakhouse for a first date? That's pretty fancy, right? I spent a little more time than usual getting ready, making sure I looked good. After all, first impressions matter. When I got to the restaurant, I waited in the lobby for him. That's when things started feeling off. When Brian finally walked in, he looked nothing like his photos. He had gained a lot of weight, his hair was long and greasy, and his beard was a mess. His clothes were loose and stained like he'd just rolled out of bed. I was shocked, but tried not to be shallow. Maybe he'd had a rough week or something. We sat down, and when the waiter came to take our drink orders, Brian immediately asked for 2 baskets of bread. Not 1, but 2. He insisted we needed them. When they arrived, he dove into the bread like he hadn't eaten in days, tearing it apart with his hands. By the time our actual meals came, I was already feeling uneasy. True to his word, he ordered the prime rib. I went with the chicken Alfredo, figuring it was a safe choice. While we waited for the food, I tried making conversation, hoping to understand Brian a bit better. So I asked him again about his business ventures, curious about what he was working on. He laughed, shrugged, and told me not to worry about it. Another red flag, but I brushed it off. Then, out of nowhere, he shifted the conversation to nursing school and asked how much it was costing me. I thought it was an odd question, but I answered anyway, telling him how much I was paying to get my license. That's when things took a bizarre turn. He suggested I drop out of nursing school and invest every cent I had into Bitcoin. Now, I know Bitcoin is a hot topic today, but this was in early 2016 when it was already skyrocketing. This guy was telling me to abandon my future in nursing and throw all my savings into it when it was at its peak. It was sitting at about $12,000 back then. Had I listened to him, I would have lost everything when it crashed just a couple of months later. He bragged about how he'd dumped all his life savings into it just the week before and how he was convinced he'd be rich soon. At that moment, everything started to click. Brian wasn't just weird, he was broke. He had put everything into Bitcoin and was probably using dating apps to find women he could convince to do the same, maybe even score a free dinner in the process. My suspicions were confirmed when the bill came and he forgot his wallet. He casually asked if I could cover it, claiming he'd get the next one. Right. When the waiter brought the check, Brian asked for 2 to-go boxes and another basket of bread. He stuffed his leftovers into one box, then filled the other with my leftovers and every last piece of bread. I almost felt sorry for the guy. Almost. But then, I remembered he had ordered the most expensive thing on the menu, a $30 steak, while I'd gone with a $12 plate of pasta. At the end of the night, I paid for the meal, but there was no way I was seeing him again. The whole experience left a bad taste in my mouth. Moral of the story, do your homework before going on a date and don't let yourself get used as a free meal by someone who doesn't know how to manage their money. And yeah, Bitcoin's doing well now, but back then, Brian's investment timing was terrible, and I doubt things worked out for him. Safe to say, there was no second date. Back in 2013, I made a dumb choice that still haunts me. I was 19 and just starting to mess around with dating apps. I don't remember which one it was, but I matched with this guy named Kyle. He had this laid-back vibe, seemed tall and muscular, with dirty blonde hair. We hit it off quickly, just chatting about random things. After a day or so of texting, he asked if I wanted to hang out. Looking back, I should have said no, but I was bored, restless, and kind of curious. He invited me to his place, and that's when a little voice in my head told me this might be a mistake. I knew it was safer to meet someone in public first, but for some reason I ignored that voice. We hadn't exchanged many pictures, and we hadn't even talked on the phone, but I figured, what's the worst that could happen? I agreed, and he sent me his address. He said we could just chill, maybe watch a movie or grab some food. It sounded low-key, and I was only planning to stay for an hour or two anyway. It was around 8 p.m. when I finally got ready and plugged his address into my GPS. The place was about 15 minutes away, on the other side of the town. I drove through a few dark streets until I reached a dead end that led me into a small, dingy motel. My stomach dropped. Why had he given me the address of this sketchy place instead of a regular house? I should have turned the car around right then, but for some reason, I didn't. I parked in one of the few empty spots, staring up at the rundown building. There were maybe 10 rooms on each floor, with flickering lights illuminating the balconies. A few cars sat in the lot, but it was mostly deserted. Some windows had curtains drawn tight, while others were dark and empty. I sat in my car for a minute, my heart pounding as I pulled out my phone to text Kyle. I messaged Kyle. "You didn't mention we'd be meeting at a motel." He responded pretty fast, saying he didn't want to scare me off, but he really wanted to see me. He claimed he was only staying there for a couple of days, waiting to move into a new apartment. Apparently, all his stuff was in a nearby storage unit, and his last lease ended sooner than he expected. It was a long string of excuses, but I got the gist. He was between places and just needed somewhere cheap to crash. As sketchy as it all sounded, I decided to believe him. He'd been so chill until now, so I thought, why not give him the benefit of the doubt? Dumb, I know. I told him the motel seemed a little shady and I wasn't too sure about going in. He said he understood, but this was the best he could do with the rent and deposit situation for his new place. Then he asked me to come in, telling me his room number. It was one of the few rooms with a light on, ground floor, just a bit to my left. I sat there for a minute, staring at the door, feeling uneasy. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. It's normal to feel weird about an old rundown motel, right? I didn't text him back, but after a couple more minutes of sitting in my car, I decided to go in. His story seemed legit enough. As I opened my car door and started walking towards the room, something caught my attention from one of the windows. I glanced over and saw a guy peeking out from behind the curtain in Kyle's room. But it wasn't Kyle. It didn't look anything like the guy in his profile picture. As soon as I noticed him, he ducked out of sight and yanked the curtain closed. It was so quick, but I was sure that wasn't Kyle. The dude didn't even have the same hair color. I froze, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. Was someone else in the room with him? I pulled out my phone and texted him, "Who's with you in the room?" His reply came almost instantly, "No one. I'm here alone." My gut screamed at me to leave, so I turned around and hurried back to my car. I texted him again, telling him I'd seen someone in the window, and his reply was something like, "No, you didn't. Come on in already." That sealed the deal for me. I was out of there. I jumped in my car, slammed the door, and drove away without looking back. As soon as I got home, I blocked him. The whole drive back, my heart was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to making a huge mistake. I still don't know if it was a catfish situation or if he had someone else in the room, but either way, it was the creepiest experience I've ever had with a dating app. Looking back, I was lucky. So freaking lucky I didn't walk into that room. I hadn't really thought about this for a long time until a recent chat with a friend brought it back. I'm pushing 40 now, so this must have happened when I was around 18 or 20. I briefly dated a guy I met while working at a strip mall. He used to come by the shop all the time, flirting with me whenever I was on shift. I was super shy and clueless back then, not used to that kind of attention. Looking back now, it's clear he picked up on my low confidence and awkwardness. That kind of makes you an easy target, you know? He was a bit older than me, probably in his late 20s, but I didn't think much of it at the time. We had our first little date during one of my breaks at the food court. Everything seemed normal until he started asking me to come over to his place after work. That should have been my first warning sign, but I was young and didn't see it. After a few weeks of chatting on the phone and more food court breaks together, I finally agreed to hang out at his place. His apartment wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute drive from where I lived, so I thought it would be fine. As I headed there, I felt this weird knot in my stomach, but I brushed it off as nerves. I hadn't dated much, so I figured I was just overthinking. When I got to his apartment, we sat in his living room watching TV for a bit. He then lit up a joint. Now, I smoked a bit back then, but nothing heavy. I definitely smoke way more now than I ever did back then, thanks to adulting, I guess. Anyway, he passed the joint to me, and I only took a couple of hits. Almost right away, I realized something was wrong. I got way higher than I should have for just a few puffs. Something wasn't right. I noticed something odd. He wasn't really smoking when I passed the joint back to him. He'd act like he was taking a hit, but then hand it back, saying I needed to relight it. For some reason, I couldn't keep it burning, and it was getting on my nerves, so I just set it aside and tried to focus on relaxing. But my head was spinning, and I felt like I was losing control of my body. He casually suggested I finish smoking and lie down for a bit. At that point, all I wanted was to leave. When I tried to stand, I could barely get up. He noticed and got up, pretending to help me, but instead he kept pushing me deeper into the couch. That's when the fear really hit. I realized this wasn't just a bad vibe. Things were about to go downhill fast. I'm not exactly small, but I felt powerless as he started trying to pull my clothes off. His hand was around my neck, and he began forcing himself on me,